John Byrne is a comics legend. He's earned that status many times over, being responsible for many of the most well-known and adapted stories of the last 50 years. His runs on Avengers, Fantastic Four, and especially the X-Men are high points of each franchise. But today I want to focus on my favorite Byrne run, his Superman work in the Man of Steel miniseries and the Triangle era of the books that followed. I'll recap why the Man of Steel reboot happened, and then what I think makes his artwork on this run so perfect. The Man of Steel is a 1986 comic book series that redefined Superman's origin story. The series spans 6 issues and was inked by Dick Gordiano. It emerged after the 1985-86 event Crisis on Infinite Earths, which reset many of the characters in the DC Comics universe. While a lot of other artists and inkers made significant contributions, the relaunch of the character was primarily a vision of one man, Canadian writer-artist John Byrne. DC wanted to refresh Superman's narrative, making him the sole survivor of Krypton, and Byrne's story and the later run introduced these changes. It covers key moments in Superman's life, from the infant Kal-El escaping Krypton's destruction, to his arrival in Kansas and emergence from an artificial womb. The series also depicts his teenage years in Smallville, where he learns about his origins, his early days at the Daily Planet and Metropolis, the creation and management of his superhero identity, and his first encounter with Batman. It reveals his journey to discover the truth about his birth parents and their home planet. Byrne has written, somewhere in the Julie Schwartz years, the sci-fi aspects of Superman's origin got pushed to the fore, and the emphasis started to shift to the whole stranger in a strange land characterization, more and more, ignoring the fact that he had been raised as a human being, an American in fact, and that it was life on Krypton that would have been alien to him. Around the time he started swearing "Bye Rao," I shook my head. Did the people in charge not realize that every time he did that, he was spitting in the faces of Jonathan and Martha Kent? Additionally, the series reintroduces new takes on important characters, including Lois Lane as his love interest, and Lex Luthor, who transitions from a mad scientist to a powerful businessman. The impact of Man of Steel was lasting, establishing a new status quo for Superman that influenced subsequent comic series for years. This origin story remained part of DC Comics continuity until it was revisited in the 2003 limited series Superman Birthright, which lasted until about 2009. Superman, as created by Siegel and Schuster, was originally envisioned as a character for a daily comic strip. He first appeared in Action Comics #1 in April 1938, where his origin story was condensed into just one quick page. His popularity skyrocketed, and by the summer of 1939, he was headlining both Action Comics and his own title, Superman, the first character to successfully carry 2 comic titles. Later, after the Byrne relaunch and through the 90s, Superman would headline 4 monthly comics, while also featuring in countless miniseries and crossover events. Over the decades, Superman's story expanded with new characters and plots. After Siegel and Schuster's departure, different writers and artists contributed to the Superman mythos. In 1945, the concept of Superboy was introduced, showcasing Superman's adventures as a child in Smallville. By 1959, his status as the last Kryptonian was altered with the introduction of his cousin, Supergirl. These additions sometimes clashed with the earlier narratives, particularly as comic book storytelling transitioned from the Golden Age to the Silver Age, leading to inconsistencies. To resolve these conflicts, the idea of the DC multiverse was introduced in the Flash 123, which distinguished between the Golden Age heroes on Earth 2 and the newer heroes on Earth 1. While this multiverse concept provided a solution, it became too complex for casual readers, prompting DC to simplify its continuity through the Crisis on Infinite Earths series in 1985. This event allowed for a reboot of several characters, including Superman, leading to the creation of Byrne's Man of Steel. Before Crisis on Infinite Earths, there was a push from DC editors and writer Marv Wolfman to revise Superman's character. Various proposals were made, but it wasn't until DC's then publisher Jeanette Kahn sought new ideas that real progress occurred. While some writers, like Cary Bates, wanted to maintain existing continuity, others, like Wolfman, Frank Miller, and Steve Gerber, advocated for a fresh start. Eventually, executive editor Dick Gordiano learned that John Byrne was available and discussed how he would approach the Superman reboot. With most of Byrne's ideas aligning with DC's vision, he was given the green light to develop the Man of Steel. Byrne originally planned a longer arc, but due to the need for a full reboot, he condensed his vision into this 6-issue series. From an artistic perspective, Byrne made some subtle changes that kept the classic elements and punched them up. The logo got much bigger, and he reimagined the S-curl into a more natural hair shape. As small as these changes seem now, where we've seen Absolute Superman and New 52 Superman, these seem like really small changes, but they cause ripples in fandom all the same. And DC wasn't as committed as Byrne thought they ought to have been of his reboot, causing further confusion among comic readers who sought definitive answers to the smallest inconsistencies. He reflected, DC was publishing Who's Who at the same time I was working on Superman, and one of the lesser battles I found myself engaged in was stopping them from listing my version as Superman 3, precisely because I wanted to accept that my Superman was the character who had first been published in 1938. In later years, I realized that was a mistake. If I allowed my version to be labeled as Superman 3, it would have silenced complaints from most of the more anal fanboys. For his visual take on the character, he explained, I drew from a lifetime of influences: Wayne Boring, Kurt Swan, George Reeves, Christopher Reeve, the Fleischer cartoons, so much stuff. And I tried to distill it all down into my Superman. Some of you may be surprised not to see Neal Adams on that list. Truth to tell, I was not a big fan of Neal's Superman. His Batman, his X-Men, his Avengers, just about everything else is gold standard. But there was something off in his Superman. If you're a fan of comic art like I am, be sure to like this video and subscribe. I'll have a lot more deep dives into the legendary artists whose work inspires us, and that's the best way to make sure you see it. Also, you can click on the link tree in the description right below to take a look at the comics this art inspired me to make. We Are Scarlet Twilight is a pulp-influenced thriller inspired by Batman and other heroes of the 30s and 40s. It's a combination of the Art Deco atmosphere of Golden Age comics with all the best stuff we expect to see in comics today. And my other book, August, is an 80s inspired sci-fi space opera with some spaghetti western thrown in. If you're a fan of Star Wars, Transformers, He-Man, any of that stuff, this is the book for you. I tried to make it feel like something awesome from the late 80s that you get to go back and read for the first time. You can check out both of these at the link below: single issues, collections, or live campaigns. And let's get back to the video. One surprising note, he claimed he didn't specifically base his take on Christopher Reeve, although there's a strong resemblance. He once wrote, not literally, when asked if his Superman was based on Reeve. Rather, it was a fusion of all my Supermen, absorbed over a quarter century. Byrne didn't see the character as needing a dramatic reimagining. Rather, he looked to clear out the complicated elements that had been added through the years, so the elements that catapulted Superman to popularity could be highlighted again. He explained, it's possible that coming in from England and Canada allows me a cleaner view of the icon. Possibly I'm able to see the barnacles for what they are. Perhaps what I'm bringing to Superman is the alien view. Byrne added, the adventures of Superman and George Reeves' portrayal of the title character is what introduced me to superheroes when I was 6 years old and still living in England. It's hard to put into words the sense of wonder that filled me as I watched what was for me the first episode on my parents' tiny black and white telly. Even at so tender an age, the notion of a man leaping into the air and flying was mind-boggling. I would already have seen Disney's Peter Pan at this point, 14 times in fact, but a whole world of wonder opened up with the idea that there were people who could fly without a sprinkling of fairy dust. The Man of Steel serves as a pivotal point in Superman's story, marking the shift from the Silver Age to the modern age of comics. This division is often referred to as pre-crisis and post-crisis, reflecting the significant changes brought about by the reboot. The original story is wrapped up in Alan Moore's Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Perhaps most significantly at the time, Byrne depowered Superman just a bit from his Silver Age and Bronze Age levels, and removed Clark's Superboy period from the post-crisis timeline. Byrne explained this with the following. Too many fans consider themselves far too hip and a go-go to ever go along with the most basic conceit of serial fiction, that the main characters will survive, but we will pretend, for the sake of the story, that this is not a given. When I was a lad, I worried every time Superman fell into a kryptonite death trap. Usually I only had to wait 4 or 5 pages to find out he was going to be okay, but it never occurred to me to shrug and flip to the next story to see if he survived. Only when reading Superboy was I ever aware that there was no tension, since we knew Superboy would eventually become Superman. I refer to this as Superboy syndrome, and caution writers to be very careful about doing it when flashbacks, or significantly, flash forwards. If you reach a point at which you know no real harm can ever befall the main characters, and you are unable to simply accept that without commenting that there's no real tension, then you've crossed an important line, and there's really no point in you continuing to follow this kind of fiction. Accept it for what it is or move on, but don't find fault with the ocean because it is too wet. Another of his insights, specifically on the power levels. He had become trapped by the ridiculously high level of his own power. It was hard to imagine ever being truly impressed by anything Superman did, since he could push planets around. What twigged me to this, by the way, was the scene in the first movie in which he rips off the car door to get to Lois. After seeing him push over mountains, the audience cheered at that because it was comprehensible. I also want to take a second to focus on Byrne's art at this time. In my opinion, especially when inked by Carl Kessel, it's an art style that completely defines the mid-80s. It's a clear step away from the Bronze Age, which is almost totally defined by artists like Neal Adams and Jose Luis Garcia Lopez. But there are elements of Byrne's approach that are far more stylized than the comic art of the late 70s. He normally kept a consistent level of shadow and a light source that was usually off-center from the viewer. But Byrne brought in a more uniform approach to his cross-hatching that's a bridge to what we'd see with artists like Jim Lee and Dale Keown later. They built on his approach to shading, added even more stylization and levels of shadow density, while making their crosshatches more of a pattern in and of themselves. They also vary the light source more than Byrne, creating more cinematic illustrations. I love that stuff, the dynamism that era of comic art delivered. But there's something about the mid to late 80s style Byrne used that seems like as comic book art as comic art can get. It added new shading techniques while leaving large areas open for color that let the characters and their iconic looks take center stage. He left the Superman books a couple years in, citing editorial interference. Byrne explained, "DC hired me to revamp Superman and then immediately chickened out. They backed off the first whiff of fan disapproval, which came months before anyone had actually seen the work. During the whole 2 years I was on the project, although nothing happened that was not approved by DC editorial, there was no conscious support. They even continued to license the previous Superman. At one point, Dick Gordiano said, 'You have to realize there are now 2 Supermen, the one you do and the one we license.' Seemed counterproductive, to say the least, since far more people saw the licensed material. After 2 years of this nonsense, I was just worn down. The fun was gone." Byrne continued his legendary comic career, even coming back to Superman in a non-continuity series focused on Superman and Batman called Generations. But he still looked back with some regret on what could have been if he had been allowed to pursue the reboot as agreed upon. While it's flattering that so many people applaud my work on Superman, I can't help feeling it would have been so much better if DC had been honest with me. They hired me to reboot the character, and everything I did was approved by editorial, all the way to the top. But after a few months, I realized what they really wanted was some superstar to goose the sales, without actually changing anything. Still, his Superman was a perfect genesis of what had come before. Because Byrne did such a great job fusing elements of past versions of the character, his look for Superman stayed the standard for a long time. I'd argue until Alex Ross's version became popular, and elements of his take began to be reflected in the monthly books. When asked about his personal favorite version, he responded, "It's a tricky question because Superman is not really a single entity. It's rather like asking what's your favorite food. So I'd have to break it down. George Reeves introduced me to the character, so he will always have a special place in my heart, as will Wayne Boring, who was the principal artist when I started reading the comics. The Fleischer cartoons gave another kind of life to Superman, as did Christopher Reeve. Pick one. Can't be done." I hope you've enjoyed this look at John Byrne's Superman work. It's a version of the character that I really look at as the standard, and go back to it all the time. Let me know in the comments what you think about John Byrne, and who you'd like to see me profile next.